Hi there, it's Karen here. Following up on workshop 3, this video is all about design. What we're going to work through in this video is, firstly, we're going to just touch very briefly on the checklist that we brought to you in workshop 3, and we're going to remind you about the steps that you would go through. We're going to also look at the model that helps us understand whether we have a blue zone or a red zone meeting. But what we're going to mostly concentrate on is an approach, a technique, a discipline for how to actually design and run blue zone meetings. You'll remember that we talked about different types of work that have to go on for groups to really work well. This list is a list that will be very familiar to people in most corporate environments. These are the sorts of things that people think of as proper, legitimate work. Work that doesn't fall on that list is often thought of as non-productive or wasting time before you get back onto the real work. But that is really a mistake to think that way, because much of the work that goes on this list can only be done if you're also doing work that is about the emotional and relationship going on in the group and within individual people, the work that goes with that. If we can, as leaders, value these two elements of work equally and balance the relationship between them, we have a greater possibility of creating the kind of working conditions that allow for really truly adaptive organisation work, which involves real dialogue, innovation, creation of completely new ways of working, and solving complex problems to be more effective. I've certainly had more than my fair share of virtual meetings where I've ended up with the same kind of emotional state that you might recognise in this picture. What am I doing here and what is going on? These are far more common than people might think, and it's largely because as human beings we are more likely to keep repeating something that's familiar, even if it is uncomfortable, non-productive, and we know for sure it's getting us nowhere, than we are to try something new. And this is particularly important to understand in an organisation a bit like yours, because people put a lot of value in being an expert, and they don't always want to try something new because it will be a learning process to start with. So they carry on doing something that's less than ideal, but they understand or know what's going to happen. So we're hoping that this rather structured process we're going to give you will give you the confidence to break the pattern that leads to some of these outcomes. So we're going to really concentrate on thinking like a designer in order to create impactful virtual meetings. You'll remember from the checklist we had 5 major steps as to how to really hold and work with effective and efficient virtual work. We're going to concentrate in this video on number 1, the design process. We tend as leaders often, again in very expert environments, to leap straight for number 2 and jump straight into creating content and slide packs and information that we're going to use in a call or a webinar. But what we do when we start with number 1 and design is we really start to think clearly, or at least more clearly, about purpose and outcome before we start creating content and information. So I'm not going to go through this checklist any further than this, because you have the full checklist from workshop 3. But remember that what we're about to talk about is the first step in that process. So you remember we touched on the idea that different types of meetings carry different intellectual and emotional loads. So something that's a simple task, which is a deployment of known thinking and has a clear answer, it just needs to be found. And it doesn't really require shifts in things like power dynamics or identity or status or certainty. It doesn't carry any of that real load for people. Those kinds of activities can be carried out with real certainty and clarity and speed. The greater the complexity of the problem, which might mean that there isn't any obvious answer or there's lots of side effects or unknowns, and or that there's lots of emotional load, and we talked at the workshop about the scarf triggers. Now again, I'm not going to go into those in this video because I have already forwarded to you some information where you can look up more about the scarf triggers. But when we have a combination of complex intellectual work and complex emotional or interpersonal work, we have to design our workshops or our meetings with the capacity to draw people into much more intimacy. And when we're in that space, we have to do something very different. So the increasing complexity and load requires us to have more dialogue and more slow thinking. And it will definitely not work if you apply very fast thinking techniques. So when we're down right in the bottom left hand corner with simple known tasks and problems and puzzles with very little emotional load attached to them, we're in what we like to think of as the blue zone. When we're in the blue zone, we can go fast, we can create fixed agendas using tight timings. We don't often need to use breakouts and small group process. We can use the whole group working together. And we don't need to do a lot of dialogic sense making and deep exploration. We don't have to know a huge amount about how we feel about a subject. We just need to work on what we know. The drive for efficiency is really the key on this one. And real work is often highly task focused in this area. And this is all in service of applying what we know. And remember, when we are repeating or applying what we already know, we can go much faster than when we need to learn something new. Now in the red zone, which is up in the top and the top right corners of this chart, we have to do something completely different. We're not going to concentrate on that in this video. There'll be a separate video about red zone working with some tips and techniques and a design for working in the red zone. And being in the red zone means we often have to unlearn things. So that's going to be that much more difficult to do and requires different types of facilitation. So let's get serious about working in the blue zone and have a look at a technique that you might like to try out. Before we go there, the first thing to say is that a tool does not make for a good meeting. And if you attempt to just try what I'm about to show you out without thinking about any of the other things that we have been working on in workshops 1, 2 and 3, you're probably not going to make it work. This is, even though it's quite a simple tool and it's applied to simple, non-complex meetings, it's still quite sophisticated, and it's actually one which your leadership skills, your virtual leadership presence will still be required. So let's just pause for a moment and remember what we've covered so that you can think about how to integrate this. So from workshop 1, remember we focused on some of the really important presence issues and techniques for how to get you and your group into the right working frame of mind. So this means things like focusing, how you prepare to be focused, how you insist that they prepare to be focused, and how you carry out things like a focus exercise at the beginning of your work. Checking in. Research tells us that in a virtual environment, people find it very hard to keep track of who is on the call and who is participating. Checking in and understanding who is there is just as important in the blue zone as in the red zone, but we might focus it in a different way because we're focusing on the task elements of work, and we don't have to develop quite the levels of intimacy that we would for a red zone work. If you are the person leading this blue zone call or meeting, more than anyone else in the space, you have to be listening with your whole body and presence. So think about how much more you understood about what was going on when you paid attention with that whole body presence. You still have to get the hygiene factors right, even when you're working in the blue zone. And teach your people how to do things like virtual nodding and keeping their participation clean and focused so that they can help you have a great meeting. And in workshop 2, we focused on the leader's role in building and demanding trust within your group. And above all, that was about integrity and discipline, about respect, about turning up on time, and all sorts of other simple things that just build the trust bank account between you and the group. But also, a group will have to learn to trust each other, and sometimes as a leader this means challenging poor behaviour clearly but without punishing people in front of the group particularly. So if you have and you spot poor behaviour, you might want to take that offline in the first instance, but to really help people to notice how different behaviours are affecting them. And you may remember in workshop 2, we actually gave you a little model for giving feedback, which was called the BOF model, which is one way of challenging both good and poor behaviour, offering feedback on both. And if that passed you by and you just didn't even, that didn't land with you, now might be a good time to go back and have a look at it. Whatever technique you use, including this technique in the blue zone, you need to invest in building a high-performing team. And so thinking about all the other things we covered in that, about vulnerability and support systems that help create that capacity to perform really well. And we'd also covered a bit about cultural differences, about things like time and other factors, and that's really worth investing in your own understanding. And finally, from workshop 2, we explored the different types of facilitation skills that people need to build. And this focuses on the difference between push skills and pull skills. So, for example, you'll remember that we talked in the push environment about directive, advice giving, giving the answer basically as the coach or the facilitator or leader. And in the pull area, we're really kind of asking questions and releasing and enabling. And in workshop 3, we tried to pull some of these things together into a clearer focus on what you're actually even having the interaction in the virtual space to deliver. What is the purpose of your meeting? Why are you having it? What is the outcome you're after? And really investing in understanding the complexity of that and eliminating the capacity to do fake work or pseudo work so that you can design your meeting, knowing what type of meeting it is, knowing what the purpose of the meeting is about, and being able to design appropriately. So let's take ourselves back. We're in the blue zone. We want to design a meeting. We're starting to master all of those leadership skills that are required, and now we want to have a technique to run the meeting really well. So it's useful to establish some core principles about your meetings in the blue zone and in the red zone, but let's concentrate on the blue for now. It's very easy for leaders to fall into a habit of thinking that just because they are the leader on some piece of paper on a hierarchy, that meetings of the team are only for them to control and design. But leaders can choose to act towards their groups as if everyone is sort of an equal adult participant. Just because you have a different hierarchy does not make people less of an adult human being. So it's worth starting to run your meetings as if and with the intention that every attendee is an equal member. And we're going to explore in the process itself how you can change some of the techniques you use to do that. But it's an attitude of mind that leaders have to get into. In terms of the discipline, we have to insist on things like the meeting always starts on time. And, you know, there are lots of sloppy behaviours that get reinforced by not starting just because somebody is missing. If somebody is late, then you have to understand that this is actually very disrespectful to everyone else in the meeting. And as I mentioned before, the first time that happens, I would just take that offline and maybe have a conversation about that impact. If it happens consistently, then it would become a performance issue, just like every other performance issue. And people can also be encouraged to get it right by all the things that we talked about in the other disciplines, like getting people to come into meetings 10 minutes early and trying to encourage your team not to put meetings into their diary back to back. Finishing your meeting on time also allows them to respect other meetings, and if anything becomes more complex than it appears to be and your meeting starts to go out of control, then you actually use the group itself to make decisions about that. One of the key principles of this particular approach we're going to introduce you to is that when you're forming the agenda, every item on that agenda must be able to be dealt with, and the purpose that it's on the agenda achieved within 20 minutes. If it's bigger than that, then it should not be in this meeting, and you never ever mix blue and red zone topics. So this is an interesting and useful list to start to work with your team, because every member of your team needs to understand the same principles to help you get this right. So I'm going to introduce you to a system called Synectics Agenda system. It's just one of many processes that people can use for highly participative, engaged, but very practical blue zone style meetings. But it's one that we find particularly helpful. And here are some of the rules of the Synectics Agenda system. Firstly, everyone is clear about the purpose of every item on the agenda. And I'll say in a minute a bit more about what we mean by purpose, because there is a very formulaic way of understanding purpose which allows everyone to develop the discipline. When people put items onto the agenda, they have to understand that they are going to be responsible for that item before the meeting, during the meeting, and after the meeting. This makes it much less likely that people will ask you to put something on an agenda just to have a moan about it without any intention of changing anything. The Synaptics system requires or suggests at very least that you should rotate certain accountabilities through your whole team, and there is no automatic leader. The boss is not the person who owns these meetings, and by rotating accountability you get a sense of equality in responsibility for the quality of the meeting, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Because you are disciplined and you have time limits, people are able to stay focused and prioritise their items with real rigour. People normally experience high levels of energy and a sense of achievement at the end of these meetings. And just as a reminder, red zone work that genuinely needs dialogue, immersion in the work, and deep connection have to be treated with the respect they need in their own meetings. You have the right kind of emotional and psychological state to do the two different types of work in their respective places. Don't mix. So when we are using the Synectics Agenda system, we have to get clear about the purpose of every item that's on the agenda. And here are the 5 categories of purpose that Synectics believe are the right types of purpose for a blue zone style meeting. So you could put something on the agenda, for example, because you want to give information, you want to present something, you want to communicate something, or because you want to ask somebody else for information or clarification. So we need to be very clear, this is about the transmitting of information from one person to the group or the group to itself, and it is a communication task. Now, if we think about that for a moment, we need to think, what are the best ways to achieve the communication of information? As you've been thinking about some of the ways that we've worked with you on these 3 workshops, you'll have noticed that sometimes we use highly visual slides. We might use a single image to convey something which has to land with people as a real meaning. Sometimes we use a lot of text because it's actually complex information that we want you to see. So when you think about an agenda item within this system, it automatically, if you think it's that first one, to give or ask for information, it starts to focus the mind on what kind of information that is and how you could best transmit it within a meeting environment. Another purpose that a Synectics meeting might achieve is to actually seek views or opinions or ideas or challenge about something. So rather than offering information, you're saying, I'm putting this on the agenda because I have a question about something, or I'm unsure about what to do about something and I'd like other people's views about it. Now, be very clear, you're not asking for their agreement and you're not making a decision in the meeting itself. Those are later points. This is just that you have a question or you have an uncertainty about something and you want to, perhaps you want every person in the group to give you one idea or a reflection or a challenge that will help you go back offline and solve whatever question you have. So the third element that you might have on a third item on a Synectics agenda is that you have a problem that you want solved by the group, but it can't be a complex one. So it could be something very straightforward, but you need other people's participation to clarify and solve the problem. You may need to get agreement on something. And be clear, the purpose of having it on the agenda is to get that agreement, not to offer information that will get an agreement later. That would be the first item, but you're going to get agreement in the meeting. And again, so that makes you think about what needs to happen before the meeting so that people are ready to achieve agreement. So we start to get really focused about that. And lastly, to make a decision. It might be something that's been going backwards and forwards and you feel it's ready now for a clear decision to be made on that subject. So the way this starts to turn up in the way that you facilitate the process is that every item that goes on an agenda in a Synectics meeting is categorized against one of these 5 purposes, which means that the item owner has really thought about what they want to achieve out of the meeting, and they're not going to be lazy and waste a load of people's time spinning around, not realising that they haven't been clear about what it is they're expecting other people to contribute. Eventually, a Synectics meeting agenda will look like this. So every item will have an owner. It'll be clear what that item is. They will have reached a clear position on what the purpose is of that. And they will also have thought about how much time they think that will take to achieve. And it cannot be more than 20 minutes. Now you'll notice that the first and last items on the agenda kind of break the rules that I've just outlined. They are none of the 5 purposes that I have just outlined. And that's because we've added to the Synaptics process the importance of checking in and checking out properly, a process which is always led by the facilitator of that particular meeting. So you have a bit of check-in, you allow for check-out, and then every item in between is owned by somebody in the meeting who has put that item agenda up. So before we talk about how to create the agenda itself, let's talk about the role of the facilitator of a Synectics meeting. If you are the leader of a global team and you have regular meetings, team meetings of some kind, and this is the meeting that you think you might want to try this out on, you may be assuming that you are always the facilitator or leader of that meeting. And that's actually something we'd like to challenge. It doesn't matter where you are on the hierarchy or who reports to who. That does not determine who should run a meeting. And the Synectics meeting process, we encourage people to rotate the facilitation job through every single member of the group. So if you have one meeting a month, then you schedule an entire year of meetings and a different person facilitates each meeting in rotation. If you think about why that might be important, you might think for a moment that, for example, if you have somebody in the group or a number of people in the group who have a bit of a bad habit of doing their email whilst meetings are going on, when it comes to their turn to facilitate the meeting, they will start to notice the impact of that behaviour. So it's a very adult way of learning about taking responsibility, and gradually, as the role of facilitator rotates through the whole meeting, people realise that their turn will come, and when it does come, they will want other people to behave better perhaps than they behaved themselves. That process over time educates and equalises responsibility for the performance of the team. And you'll also notice that, as I said before, every individual item on the agenda is owned by somebody on the call who retains accountability. That is not the facilitator. So once you get into the items on the call, the item is run by the person who put it there. And that also generates extremely high levels of accountability, that you can't just ask the boss to put something on the agenda and then leave the boss holding that baby while nobody else cares about whether it actually achieves an outcome. So if you put an item on the agenda, you are going to lead that item. But the facilitator's job is to hold the whole meeting structure together, to make sure that times are maintained and discipline is maintained. If you are also using things like whiteboards or concept boards or other virtual tools while you're dealing with your items, then the facilitator might support the item owner by helping to facilitate those tools. And overall, the facilitator for any given meeting is paying attention to the group process and helping the group to learn how to use this method more and more effectively. So let's think about how we construct a Synaptics agenda. and will start before the meeting even begins. So using the virtual environment, you create an agenda live over a period of time leading up to the meeting. Now, again, this might be very different to how you currently construct meetings. If you currently have team meetings where you as the leader are the only person in charge of the agenda, and you might look at that agenda and realise there's lots of repeating items, there's lots of standing items, as we call them, or you spend the first half of the meeting reviewing whether you did the actions out of the last meeting. And all this kind of wasted pseudo work that we get involved in, this is all fake work. So you scrap all of it. Every single meeting starts with a completely blank agenda. And so if you have, say, a monthly cycle of your Blue Zone meetings, then after the end of a meeting, you wipe your whiteboard or whatever mechanism you might want to use to post up agenda items, and you put up the date of the next meeting and you wait. And any person who comes to that call then knows that they have a month or however long it is till that meeting takes place to start to put agenda suggestions onto the board. And they put it in the form of the Synaptics Agenda. So as they realise they want to talk about something with the group, like Amanda, who has a client issue that she wants to get some ideas from the group from. She thinks it's going to take 15 minutes, so she puts that up on the concept board space, or whatever it is that you're using. Everything has to be on the wall in advance of the meeting, and people can take items off the wall as well as putting them on if that's what they would like to do. Every submitted item has to have one owner, and they must be there for the meeting itself. If they fail to turn up, the item is taken off the wall. It's not carried forward to the next meeting. It's not dealt with in their absence. It is deleted from the wall. Every submitted item is clear about the purpose of that item and what the item owner is seeking to achieve. And as I said, there's no repeating items, no automatic items, and no review of the last meeting or any actions arising. We just, over the course of the period, build up a picture on the board which everyone has access to of what are the important things that you want to deal with. Then we get into the meeting itself, and the facilitator for that particular meeting would open up the whiteboard or the concept board where all of the items are put up, and they would have a check-in and a focus exercise. They would check who's on the call. They would delete from the concept board any items that doesn't have an owner because that person hasn't turned up and they are not able to delegate to anybody else to run that for them. And then they have a quick conversation led by the facilitator to actually go back over what's on the board and agree very quickly together if there is any items on there that should actually be dealt with in a different way. An example of that might be that you realise that there's an item that's up on the board that really only involves 2 people from the whole group, and it's not appropriate to do that in this setting, so they could just have a meeting offline and deal with that, and the item owner then deletes it from the board because they agree that that's not going to help. As you do that, you gradually get to a form of your agenda, and you just shuffle the tickets or that you've got on your whiteboard, or you create live on the whiteboard an agenda that looks a bit like this. These are the things that we've finally decided we are going to cover. It will be messy at first, and the first few times you do this, it'll take you almost as long to learn how to get to your agenda as running your blooming meeting. So you do have to have some patience to actually learn how to do this, and gradually your group will get very fast at making these decisions, and increasingly they'll get really good at not putting something up on the board unless they know it is the right thing to do. So this is a learning process. You will not get it right first time. We've also seen some people experimenting with other social media tools to pre-agree the agenda. So to go from the concept board with all of the agenda items into agreed agenda. But if you are the facilitator of this meeting, or if you are the leader of the group formally in the hierarchy, please do not do it for them. Never offer, I'm going to go onto the concept board, look at what's there, and I will pull together the agenda and send it back out to you. The minute you do that, you are communicating a different type of accountability for the meeting, and people will turn up unconsciously with more passivity and less engagement, and you will pay a price for that. It will seem like a shortcut, and it will not be a good thing to do. You then run the meeting and run through it. So in this case, John B will take charge after the facilitator has done the check-in and focus, as you can see on the agenda on the right here, and will then have 10 minutes to give information about the financial report. At about 9 minutes, the facilitator would probably chip in and remind John that he's only got a minute left and has he achieved what he wanted to achieve, and will gently close it down after 10 minutes. If after 10 minutes there's still work to be done on that item, you do not just carry on and do it. The group has to agree that you want to extend the meeting in order to do that. And if an item suddenly becomes a red zone item because of something that emerges in the conversation, you take it out of the meeting altogether, you defer it, and you then schedule a proper red group meeting to deal with that item. So this is all about discipline. So after the meeting, individual item owners retain responsibility. So John B led the 10-minute conversation where he gave information about the financial report, and in that process somebody said, I'd like to have a one-page summary of what you've just said, can you send it to me? If John B says yes, he will do that, then John B is the person who's responsible for doing that. And then if you have any agreed actions, each individual owner writes down their own agreed actions. The facilitator is not responsible for gathering together the actions and telling people what they've agreed. Every individual item owner is responsible for recording the things that they have personally agreed to do and then doing them. And everyone else, including the facilitator and the leader, assumes that what has been agreed is going to happen. If it doesn't happen, so if, for example, Amanda S has had agreement from everybody that they're going to send her something relating to her client issue, and then she doesn't get it, then rather than reviewing all the actions in the next meeting to see who did what, it is up to Amanda to put a new item on the next meeting, which might be a question about why people didn't send her what they agreed, or she can follow it up during the month that is between the meetings. So then the facilitation rotates to the next person on the list. The whiteboard is blanked with no carryovers, and it starts to build up the new agenda items for the next meeting. And again, you can experiment with other social media tools to communicate progress and hold the team together. So that is the process, that is the technique. Even though it's a blue zone technique, I hope you understand it's quite sophisticated because it requires high degrees of empowerment and engagement. So your team and you are probably going to have to learn how to do that, because if they already knew how to do that, then you wouldn't be facing the difficulties that you might be facing. So you need to think about, how do you introduce this technique to your team? So the first thing you need to do is introduce the practice and the method to your whole group and help them learn the theory. Maybe they'd like to see this video. Maybe you'd like to have a conversation with them about how you intend to introduce the process. Then you have to think about a relatively straightforward environment in which you could implement an experiment in starting to work with this. As I said, this might be your regular team meeting once a month or some other routine practice that goes on. Then you need to do it, and to do it with discipline and complete commitment. And if you just do it once and decide it doesn't work for you, then you won't really have achieved anything, because I can absolutely promise you the first time you use this, you will not feel very good about it, and you need to make sure your whole team understands you're on a learning curve. The way to accelerate that learning curve is to really notice how it works, what you're doing, what they're doing, and reflect and question how you're using the tool so that you can upgrade your use of the tool each time you use it. And that will accelerate the performance of your whole group in using this tool in the virtual space. So moving into action, it's very easy to want to have silver bullets and tools and techniques to solve complex problems of leadership in the virtual world. This is about as straightforward as it comes in terms of understanding a technique, but just knowing that the technique is there will not change anything. Your choice as a leader has to be to purposefully and with commitment and integrity try this out. Hold yourself in the vulnerability of knowing that you're doing something that you will not be expert in to start with. It will take more time than you're used to expending until you get good at it, and then it will start to save you time for you and your whole group. But you do have to try it and learn to make it work. So that's it from me. That's the blue group, the blue zone meeting process we wanted to offer you. In the second video in this series, we will offer you a process and some techniques for working in the red zone. And we'd love to hear your feedback about how this is working for you after you've used it a few times, and see if your group can learn how to do this really well. So bye for now, bye from me, and I look forward to hearing from you soon.